So we've looked at the kinds of transformations that we can have with functions. Now, this is an advanced organizer, and so basically I'm asking you to think about it and take a guess at what's going to happen to cause those transformations. There are two ways we can transform a function. We can manipulate the input, or the x value that we put into it before we apply the function to it, just like putting something in our function machine, changing it before we drop it in. Otherwise, we can manipulate the output, or the y value, after it comes out of the function. Both of these things will have effects on the graph of the function, and depending on what or how we manipulate it, it's going to affect the kind of transformation that we can have. And so keep in mind, when we're graphing the function, what we're actually doing is we're taking the x value as the x coordinate, the input value of the function, that is, as the x value, and then we're taking the output of the function to be our y coordinate, and then we're putting it on a graph. And so we end up with something that looks like this. We end up with a line with the inputs of the function being the x values and the outputs being the y values. And so remember, we can translate up, down, left, or right. We can stretch or compress relative to the x or y axis, or we can reflect relative to the x or y axis. And so let's look at some of the manipulations we can make. So I want you to take a guess. What do you think is going to happen to the graph if I take what comes out of the function when I put in an x, and then I add to that function value and plot that as my y value? What do you think is going to happen to the graph? It's one of these. Similarly, what's going to happen if I take my output value and I subtract a from it and then plot that as my y value? What do you think is going to happen to that graph? It's one of those. What do you think will happen to the graph if I take what comes out of the graph, what do you think will happen to the graph if I take what comes out of the function and multiply it by a negative, turn it negative? Which transformation do you think will occur? Now, what's going to happen if I take x and I add something to it and then put this value into that function? How do you think the graph of that function is going to be transformed? Translate up, down, left, right, stretch or compress, reflect. Which do you think it is? Similarly, what if I take my x value and subtract something from it, like 2 or 3 or something like that? What do you think is going to happen to the graph? Is it going to translate left, right, up, down, etc., etc.? Now, what do you think is going to happen to the graph if I multiply the x value by a negative and then put that into the function? Which of these is it going to do? Is it going to translate, stretch, or reflect? Now, I'm going to, instead of add, I'm going to multiply x by some value a. And there are two possible things to consider here. What's going to happen if I multiply x by a before I put it into the function and a is greater than 1? Or what's going to happen when a is between 0 and 1? Now, the final manipulation is when I multiply the output of the function by a. What do you think happens to the graph of the function when a is greater than 1 and I multiply the output values by a, or when a is between 0 and 1? So, try and match up what those transformations are, and if you're wrong, don't worry about it. We'll investigate it a little later.